What's up, you guys? This is Devin with CenturyFX Studios, back with another video, and today we're going to give you guys another episode of the R5 Chronicles, because now I'm going to be giving you guys my first impressions on the Canon R5. And I know I've been gone for a long time, but I'm coming back with a lot of episodes, and I'm going to give you guys a comprehensive view on this camera. So if you haven't bought it yet and you're thinking about buying it, or you're thinking about upgrading to Canon's new mirrorless lineup, you get a thorough view of what you're getting yourself into, because Canon, they just recycle the technology that they've had in the past. Now, if something's bad, they'll take it away. But for the most part, what you're going to get in this camera is what you're going to get in the lower iterations of this camera. And the same thing goes for the R6 in this camera. The only difference really is in the video capabilities of 8K and the megapixels on the still side. So let's get right into this and start talking about focus. Number one thing today is focus. Now, with this camera, one of the biggest advantages of having a mirrorless camera is the autofocus capabilities, because Canon has one of the best autofocusing capabilities with their dual pixel autofocus. It came out with their video. Now it's moved its way into their pictures. This dual pixel autofocus gives you the ability to track someone's eye. But in the DSLR world, you don't have an equivalent like that. You don't have a camera that can do that. So one of the biggest things you want to lean on is your camera's ability to track that person's eye or any subject's eye, whether they're doing portraits or whether you're doing sports. But when you're behind the camera, you have to now relinquish your ability to focus and rely on the camera. And if the camera gets it wrong, now you have to take the responsibility of showing this new camera what you want to focus on. Because one of the biggest things that people pick on my videos for is my ability to focus. Now, back in the day, I had the 5D Mark II, but now I've upgraded. And now you have to be able to either rent this camera or have this camera and have it at your disposal at some of these big events like weddings and all of these high dollar, high sensitive, high demand events where people, if you have this camera, you're going to be there and they're going to expect you to focus on them. It's not like the old days where if you softened focused a little bit on a film camera, you could get away with it because it was so hard to achieve focus, especially during, moments that require some of your highest attention, like sports and weddings and stuff like that, and wildlife where you can't control what's going on. But now you have to relinquish your ability to focus to a camera that's supposed to be... Now, it's great. Don't get me wrong. The R5 has a great algorithm for tracking the face, tracking the eye. I'm using it right now, going 4K HQ right through the R5 with an 85mm 1.8 at 1.8, and it's tracking my face. And if it's not doing a good job, you can just tell me in the comments below. But it's something that you want to rely on, but it does not get it right all the time. And your clients, the people you're going to be working with, if you're not a pro, the people that you're going to be photographing in general, if you're going to be shooting with these wide open lenses with this full frame, you're going to want to get that thing in focus and not rely on the camera. So one of the big things you have to understand when you buy this camera is you got to understand how to focus this camera. And if it does not do it right, you're going to have to know how to override it. Like Vanessa Joyce said, that it's not about focusing the camera. It's not about you doing your part and imposing your will on the camera. It's about this camera and you being in a cohesive partnership to where if the camera gets it wrong, you can guide the camera to where it needs to be and then have the camera go back to what it needs to do. Because if you're going back to the days where you were shooting DSLRs and you were using that joystick to find your autofocus and where you want, or to place your autofocus and where you wanted it to be, then it kind of defeats the purpose of having an expensive mirrorless camera to begin with. Well, and some of these mirrorless cameras are not as expensive as other mirrorless cameras, but the lenses definitely are expensive. But we'll get to that later. The next thing we want to talk about is storage. Now, storage at first was probably a hassle for a lot of R5 users. When the R5 first came out, it wasn't easy for a lot of users to actually store a lot of the 8K footage, if anybody's even trying to store that, 4K HQ footage, because a lot of people noticed that the regular standard 4K in the R5 wasn't up to par as the 4K HQ, because the 4K HQ video was a downscaled 8K, which made it look a lot better, but it took up a lot of space. But now, and the same thing goes with pictures, because pictures are 45 megapixels raw, even though that's not a really high number of megapixels. My phone can do more megapixels than that. But if you're dealing with all of these high resolution files and video files, you're going to have to need a way to store it. And back in the day we didn't, but now Canon has a firmware update that allows you to have, not only for stills, compressed RAW, but now for video you have light and IPB formats that you didn't have before. Now IPB is the compressed or JPEG version, so to speak, of their video formats. You have IPB 4K HQ, IPB 4K standard, IPB 1080p, IPB 8K, and all these other compressed file types. Why? Because these things take up a lot of space. And now not only do they have the IPB variant of HQ 4K, they also have an IPB light variant for 4K, 8K, and I believe 1080p if that's even needed. But 4K and 8K and 4K HQ all need these light IPB formats. Now, I have not compared each one. I do know that Canon listening to us and putting that in the camera's abilities makes it so much easier, and it shows that Canon is actually listening to us. Now, one of the advantages of this camera, and I'll get to this a lot later, but one of the advantages of this camera is to have firmware updates that actually change the camera. Having this ability and Canon listening to all of our thoughts makes it a better camera. Let's move on to number 3. Number 3 would be battery power. Oh, the battery power on this thing. Now, the battery power is not as bad as I thought it was going to be, because you're running a screen here, you're running the IP screen. There's nothing that is just optically, powered. It's not like a mirror where it's just bouncing light up to your eye and it doesn't need any power to do that. No, it's definitely running a lot of power, but it's not running as much power as I thought. When I went and did a wedding, and I want to say about 3,000 pictures, and then it conked out about that. I was doing about compressed RAW. I think, I was doing, compressed RAW, and I did about 3,000 pictures, and I didn't have any issues, with the battery. It conked out after that, but it did the whole wedding, and it was a small wedding. It wasn't a full day wedding. It was probably about 3 or 4 hours. I want to say about 3 hours or so. But I didn't have any issues with the battery, but that was one of Canon's new LPE6H. I think it's what they're called now, with the little golden strip on it. If I were you and I had regular Canon batteries that, didn't have the new golden strip on it, I'll probably find a way to get as many of those batteries, probably enough, at least 2 or 3 to last a wedding day, because it's probably going to conk out on you pretty soon. But other than that, there's not much more to say than it's got less battery power than the DSLRs. And you will, if you're used to having, going through a lot of batteries in your shoot sessions. If you're doing just one photo shoot a day, it wouldn't matter. But if you're doing more than one photo shoot a day, long events, you're going to want multiple batteries for this thing, because it will eat up your batteries, especially if you're doing video. The next thing I want to talk about is the buffer. Now, the buffer caught me off guard, and I'll talk about this a little bit later. But when you're using 20 frames a second and you're used to a 5D Mark II, which has 4 or 5 frames a second, you want to make sure that what you get is what you're trying to get. Because when you're going to 20 frames a second and you can't hear the shutter, you don't get that tactile response to know that your picture has been actually captured. You don't know what you're doing to the camera specifically, because the camera is taking all of this stuff in and you don't hear anything, you don't really feel anything on your camera. The only thing you might actually experience is your camera warming up on the hand grip a little bit, but other than that, you don't really experience what 20 frames a second is doing until you get into the post-production. And then your buffer hits and you're like, wait, what happened? I thought this thing was pretty good at the buffer. Well, you need to start thinking about the dual card slots when it comes to the buffering. Now, a lot of people understand that Canon has the CF Express Type B, which is a very, very fast card. But if you don't have anything really over 128 gigs, you're probably looking at 2,000 or less raw frames. It's going to be as fast as you want it to be, but it's not. You're not going to have as much to go through. So you're going to have to really pace yourself when it comes to those 20 frames a second, because you don't see or hear a tactile or feel a tactile, response when you take your picture. So you don't really, it's like spending money on a debit card or a credit card. Like, you don't see that money going away, so you don't really understand exactly how much you're doing. So to understand the effect of what you're doing, you need to really, bide yourself. And I think that Canon really needs to come up with a better way of showing that your buffer has already hit. Because if you've hit that buffer, you need to have a real, like, that red box needs to come in there. Now you get the white brackets when it's coming up there when you're taking pictures, but when that buffer comes, you need to have like a real, like a red. Because if you're taking an important moment, then you need to understand, hey, I don't have that ability to take a picture anymore. And you might think it's not focusing when the buffer's gone, but the buffer rating it recycles so fast, you don't even think about it. You also want to understand how this card slot thing works, because you have one CF Express Type B slot, but you also have an SD UHS-2 slot. Now, I have both of them filled up with both cards, but one card is not as fast as the other. And you end up paying more for the UHS-2 slot card, if that's even possible, because I didn't even thought about it, to get a card that is equivalent to the CF Express type card, and as far as speed is concerned. So the next thing we're going to get into is the electronic shutter versus the mechanical shutter. And I keep calling the mechanical shutter the manual shutter. If I do that on accident, just forgive me. But anyway, chances are if you bought this camera, you're going to want to use both shutters, because the electronic shutter has so many advantages because it's completely silent. You get that 20 frames a second. So chances are you're going to want to use both shutters at some time, because the mechanical shutter, it actually is the only shutter that allows you to use your flash and have it in perfect sync. Now, I haven't tried electronic first curtain shutter, but I'm pretty sure the first curtain electronic shutter also does not allow you to take pictures with the flashes that you have and have it in perfect sync. So you're going to need to use both of the electronic and mechanical shutters when you're using this camera. So you're going to have to understand how to go into the menu system and flip between the two. Now, the electronic shutter has way more of a responsibility than the mechanical shutter does, because the electronic shutter can actually, if you're under the wrong, lighting situations, or if you're under lighting situations in which lights flicker, projector screens, any kind of advertisements that are on the floor of your basketball games, any kind of flickering that you may see throughout the day that you don't really realize with your eyes, your electronic shutter probably can pick it up from those lights and destroy your pictures. Or you might have some electronic shutter banding that you might see that you didn't see before, because your camera is so advanced and they can pick up those things now. So you have a lot of responsibility. And now the buffer, you got 20 frames a second on an electronic shutter, but that buffer though, that buffer is going to really put it into perspective how many pictures you can take, whether you're doing RAW. Now, if you're doing JPEG, you probably don't even have to worry about the buffer, because you're going to have way more pictures than you actually need if you have, if you have enough memory on there. And you're not going to have to worry about the buffer. But if you're shooting RAW, if you're shooting any, high megabyte, consumption, it's gonna wear down on your buffer. And even if you don't see it, and the buffer doesn't hit that hard. Some cameras, the buffer hits so hard, you gotta wait. Those earlier Sonys, like the A7R Mark II, those earlier Sonys with the full frame mirrorless sensor, they were horrendous. They always told you to wait. Even some of the newer Sonys, the A7R Mark III, I think even the A7R Mark IV has a buffer issue where it has these high megapixel files they're trucking, and it just, and this is nothing against Sony, because there's some things that Sony does correct that Canon doesn't do right. But I'm just saying, you have to understand the buffer will actually keep you from shooting. So watch that. I just said it in the last section, but electronic shutter has a lot more responsibilities than the mechanical shutter. So the last thing I want to talk about is post-production. And post-production kind of coincides with all the things that I've talked about today. And that's because when you're talking about post-production, you have to understand how much you're taking in versus how much you're putting out, this, that, and the other. You need to understand that this camera is a 45 megapixel beast. It is an 8K beast. It's going to have these humongous files that cost money. So you want to understand exactly how to bring your consumption down. And I taught myself that. It was kind of a hard thing to do because I'm so used to bringing everything in and having everything and being reliant on having everything that I shot, because the last thing you want to do is go to somebody and have a nice picture of somebody that they're willing to pay for and you don't have it. So I've always been in the mood or in this kind of habit of keeping up with things rather than deleting and getting rid of things. But now that I have the rate button on the camera, which helps production out vastly, I can now rate things in camera because the camera is going to shift through the pictures 10 times, 100 times faster than Lightroom and Photoshop will. So all I gotta do is click rate, and it doesn't even have to be like 5 stars for everything. It could just be 1 star for here. Okay, 1 star, 1 button. Click, 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 click. All of a sudden, I'm done with 3,000 pictures from my last wedding, and they're all organized in whether or not I want to keep these files or not. And now I have the 300 files that I want to keep, 200 files that I want to keep and send off for a small wedding. No, it is not what everybody would think this camera is, but it is a monster in what it does. It's not perfect, but it is a monster, and I love it. Let me know what you think in the comments below. If you have any questions about the R5, let me know, and I will see you on the next video.